catch-up and also Intelligent Person's Guide to Liberalization. Suhasini Haidar, a diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hello, good afternoon. It's always lovely to be the session after lunch when everybody is lulled into a certain kind of food coma and is not going to ask very provocative questions. Obviously, I'm expecting all of you to. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for joining us in large numbers when we know that you have a choice. Our session today is both novel because of the time it's at, but it's also the most cliched. And the sort of, the idea of Asia rising is as old as the hills, because of course some of the world's biggest civilizations are from Asia. And our guests today have each written a book that really brings together where Asia is today. So I'm going to start by asking each of our guests to talk a little bit about how they see this part of resurgent Asia, if you like, and if it's resurgent at all, or what we are looking at is this small moment in time where Asia has potential, but the pitfalls are quite large as well, and we'll get to them. To start with Mr. Menon, you have, of course, been an ambassador to China as well. Your upcoming book is called Past Present, India in Asian Geopolitics. And my question really is, that we all know India is an Asian power. India is the second largest economy in Asia, in the top 3 at all times. But is India actually an Asian player even?
Well, if you look at it historically, certainly. I mean, when I say past, present, the history, it's certainly been an Asian player. Secondly, even today, I think our destiny is tied to what happens in Asia, whether it's the subcontinent, whether it's the rest of Asia. It used to be when we started radical reform in 1991 that about 15.3, I think, % of our GDP was external merchandise trade, and most of it went west through Suez. Now, most of it actually goes east. And by 2014, 49.6% of GDP was actually external merchandise trade. You add services and so on, more than half our GDP depends on the world around us. I don't think we think we're a world unto ourselves, but we're not. We're part of the world and it affects us. So yes, we are. Do we influence what happens in Asia? People keep wanting to have more influence than they might have today, but we do. We are a factor, whether it's in global markets, whether it's in terms of security, both maritime and on land. And certainly our affinities, our relationships across each of our borders and with the rest of Asia have grown tremendously in the last 20 years. I think Deepak's book speaks about this. So my own summary is, yes, we're a nation power. If you look at the past, we've done best when we are most connected to the world. It's those bits of India which were most connected, which historically were the most advanced. Gujarat, Malabar, Coromandel Coast, Vanga in the larger sense, including. These are the bits that accounted for India at one stage being the major industrial power in the world. But even today, I think we need to think of ourselves as part of Asia, and that's why I wrote this book, actually, about India and Asian geopolitics, because I think we lose track of that. The problem, of course, is that Asian geopolitics keeps changing. And today, you have a rising China, you have a globalized world, you have new authoritarian leadership across, you have ultra-nationalism. I don't like the word populism, because that sort of hands over the people to these leaders, which is not a good idea. But in any case, you have a whole new situation where if you don't engage with Asia, you're actually going to be in real trouble.
Well, Very well put. India has been at its best when it is most engaged with Asia. So it's not a question of whether India should be or whether India needs to be or not. Bruno, your book is called The Dawn of Eurasia, on the Trail of a New World Order. Now, I have to tell you that the New World Order as a phrase is a little passé. These days, everyone wants to talk about the New World Disorder much more. But I do want to ask you, just as a segue, one of the first I mean, New World Order has been used so many times by people, but I remember A.G. Wells writing about it in 1940. And straight after that, and he talked about, the brotherhood of man and people coming together with a good idea. Straight after that, it was actually seen as the subject of conspiracy theories. So the New World Order essentially meant a secret communist clique that was going to upend all governments around the world and create this global world. And of course, then we got the United Nations. So I do want to ask you on the same thing, because you're talking about Eurasia. You're not, as so many scholars are, focusing on India's maritime surroundings and the Indo-Pacific. You're actually talking about the old world order in many ways of the terrestrial swathe of Asia. Is there a strategy to Eurasia today?
Yes, my book is essentially the idea that we should get used to talking about Europe and Asia as one single continent. And this is connected to the fact that Asia is rising. Why have we started talking about Europe and Asia as separate continents? It's not because they are separate geographies. There's no border. If you travel in what is the conventional border between Europe and Asia, you don't see any physical, any visible border. So the distinction for me, and this is how I start the book, is much more a historical decision, a historical distinction. It's much more the idea that Europe was for long periods more advanced, historically more advanced than Asia, more developed. Now, if we talk about the rise of Asia, we have to conclude that fundamentally it's done. Fundamentally the convergence has happened. In many respects, if you travel from, let us say, some Chinese cities back to Brussels or back to Paris, you feel like you're going back in time, not forward in time. That is my experience, flying from Beijing to Brussels. And so if this is the case, and if the distinction between Europe and Asia was based on the idea that Europe is more advanced, then I think we've reached the moment when we have to accept that Europe and Asia are essentially the same geography, the same space. And I think, in fact, Asians have been faster and more active at recognizing this. You saw that Singapore had a spectacular rise. Why? It wasn't interested in developing its local regional connections. In fact, it broke with Malaysia, it had bad relations with Indonesia, so it quickly developed connections to Europe and to the United States. China today, very obviously, is not interested in its immediate region. In fact, China is reaching out to Europe. It's become a very dominant power in Europe, and many Europeans are concerned about this. So you see that the success stories in Asia are in fact Eurasian success stories, in the sense that it's the countries in Asia that have started working on a larger space that have been successful. And I think Europeans and Westerners have to join this recognition that it is a new world, it is a new world order. And let me finish by saying the people that talk about disorder in the times of changes are usually those that benefited from the old order and that say disorder everywhere. Those that didn't benefit from the old order are much more interested in seeing what is new and how the world is changing.
Very interesting. There is a certain status quo element to a lot of what has been said about Europe and Asia, and now you bring in Eurasia. Deepak Nayyar, your book, you write yourself, is written as a counter, in a sense, to 1968 and Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama, in a sense. But your book is just, and really it's amazing to look at some of the figures that you've put out there. When Bruno said that, it was earlier, it was Europe, and then it was Asia, it's a question of relative time, because before that, there was also Asia. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, what is startling, and I'll let you explain why it's so startling, is the numbers of what China and India represented in the past is actually closer to what China and India represent today than it has been in the middle.
Absolutely. 2 centuries ago, in 1820, Asia accounted for 2/3 of world population and 3/5 of world income. The subsequent decline of Asia was attributable to its integration with the world economy, shaped by colonialism, but driven by imperialism. By 1970, in terms of income levels, Asia was the poorest continent in the world, poorer than Africa. In the half century since then, Asia has witnessed a profound transformation in terms of economic progress of nations and living conditions of people. By 2016, it accounted for 1/3 of world income, more than 2/5 of world manufacturing, and more than 1/3 of world trade, while its income per capita converged towards the world average, still way behind industrialized countries. Now, this transformation was uneven across countries and between people. Even so, predicting it even 50 years ago would have required an imagination run wild. Indeed, Asia's economic transformation, I believe, in this short time span is almost unprecedented in history. But we need to recognize the diversity of Asia. There were marked differences between countries in geographical size, embedded histories, colonial legacies, nationalist movements, initial conditions, natural resource endowments, population, income levels, and political systems. They were different in every possible way we can think of. So were development outcomes. They differed across countries. Yet, despite this diversity, it is possible to discern a pattern. What drove the transformation of Asia was what could be described as stunning economic growth, higher than anywhere else in the world, whether industrialized countries or developing countries. And this was bolstered by rapidly rising investment rates and the spread of education in society. This growth was led by rapid industrialization that was sometimes, not always, export-led, with structural changes in the composition of output and employment. Now, it is essential for us to note that this transformed social indicators of development, whether life expectancy, literacy rates, just as it transformed income levels. But it was hugely unequal. You know, East Asia was the leader, South Asia was the laggard. Southeast Asia and West Asia were somewhere in between. But what did happen was this process of growth was associated with rising economic inequality. There was a massive reduction in absolute poverty, but the poverty that persists in Asia, despite this unprecedented growth, is in fact as awesome, as stunning as the reduction in absolute poverty. So that what we have seen is that the share of the top 10% has risen rapidly. The share of the bottom 50% has remained unchanged or declined. And indeed, there is a concentration in the richest 1%. And the remaining 99% are way behind. Now, in this process, governments everywhere played the role of a supporter, a catalyst, a leader in this economic and political and social transformation. And it was their capacity to complement markets. But where governments were unable to perform this role, those countries became laggards in development. Now, the rise of Asia, I believe, to connect with what Bruno and Shankar are saying, is discernible in the world economy. It is beginning to shift the balance of economic power. Admittedly, the current economic situation or political situation are not conducive to the kind of benefits Asia drew in the previous 30 years. Much will depend on how Asia copes with the challenges and exploits the opportunities. Yet, I can say with some degree of confidence, although futurology is different, that in 2050, Asia will account for more than 1/2 of world income and will be home to more than 1/2 the people on Earth. which was the reality in 1820, however difficult it is to recognize this. But please remember that Asian countries will become world powers by 2050, but at much lower levels of income than the West, which has its own implications.
When the West did it. And it's very interesting you should say so, because I'm looking around the audience, and the moment you said, and it's been half a century since 1970, you can see people thinking, my God, it's been quite that long. Ambassador Menon, so you've said, we've set this course of where Asia is headed. There seems to be no doubt that Asia is rising, that the world must look at this, continent and the entire landmass towards the future. But I do want to ask, in all of this, where is India? Because India is not part of ASEAN. We're not part of really any of the other groupings. We seem to be walking out of our own grouping, which is the South Asian grouping. We don't want to be part of the trade grouping even, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Is India actually engaging with Asia, as you'd suggested?
I think we have no choice. In fact, that's why I wrote the book, because what worried me is that, if Asia is going back to the future, going back to what it was, then India surely should be part of it if India wants to benefit, as she did over the last 40 years. I mean, India was one of the biggest beneficiaries of this great wave of change of resurgent Asia. But if we want to keep doing that, we have to be integrated into the region, not just the subcontinent, but into the larger region. And I'm worried that we now think that we can do it all on our own, and that the world has no choice but to come to us. After all, we're a huge market. Where will they go? That, I think, is dangerous thinking, because nothing is inevitable. I mean, these are all the result of policy choices, and a series of policy choices over the last 40 years, which have actually led to the changes in India and the growth in India. And if we want to continue that, we have to keep making those choices. Besides, the external situation has changed. So to keep doing the same thing in a different situation and expecting the same result, I think, is another version of madness. You really need to adjust to the shifting order that we see around us. The RCEP was one choice. Now, we've kept the door open to going back in, because ultimately, it seems to me, you are now dealing with three very large regional blocks in the world. You're dealing with North America under the NAFTA, or whatever new names they want to give it, the EU, and now the RCEP. And between them, these are the three blocks that will determine the course of the world economy in the future. It'll be a negotiation between them. And if India is not at the table, how do you guard your own interests? Nobody else shares your interests 100%. There is a case to be made for India's uniqueness, which is why we have chosen a level of strategic autonomy throughout. But you need to be at the table, at least, to defend those interests, to build alliances with others and work with them, until you have the power to shape the environment yourself, which you still don't have entirely.
A very quick and different answer to your question. The story of resurgent Asia is dominated by the rise of China. But it is not only about China. India is, there's a dichotomy. India is a part of the growth story of Asia, for sure. Its rising share of world income and trade. However, India is an awful laggard in terms of human development. Right. So you look at levels of poverty, you look at social indicators, infant mortality rates, they are worse than sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and in India. So that the point I want to make is that the economic development of nations and the well-being of people is closely connected. Together, they create a virtuous circle. But if you have unequal opportunities, and if this growth in India does not move in tandem with social progress and human development, this growth will grind to a halt, for sure. And therefore, if India is going to be part of the Asia story, in terms of improving well-being of its people, it is going to have to make sure that this growth is inclusive. And the only way you can do that is to create jobs, and jobs are missing.
Okay, I want to turn away from India a little bit to talk about what's happening in the rest of Asia and how the rest of Asia sees it. Interesting that you made the point that moving from one of the Chinese cities to Europe is sometimes actually going backwards. The truth is, where we have seen the most rapid but silent rise has been in the connectivity between Chinese cities and European cities. So across this swathe of Eurasia that Bruno has written about. And I wanted to ask you about where you see the real impact of what some would call right now is the big Eurasian project, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. The reason I say it's a Eurasian project much more is because China already had the maritime trade routes it really was looking for. Maybe a few more it could have added to its kitty. But where we're seeing the hugest amount of growth is along the land routes. You know, I think there's close to 27 cities in China that now connect to about 20 or 30 cities in Brussels, in Europe, simply by railroad. And Ambassador Menon has heard this story too many times already. But I do want to tell you that I saw with my own eyes the strangest thing, which was this dry port in a town called Urumqi, which is in Xinjiang, which is all there in the news, and a railway line, a train with a big red bow on the front of it, that was essentially inaugurating the railway line from Urumqi to, I think, close to 7,000 kilometers away, out in Naples. And what was this train carrying? Because clearly there are no passengers taking this route that takes about a week, 10 days across and back. It was full of about 300 cartloads of ketchup. Now think about that China is looking at these markets. That train probably came back completely empty. But this is where the push for China came from its land boundaries as well, through Central Asia and across Eurasia. So the question to come back to it is, how much is the Eurasian project linked to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, it's very much linked. Let's think what China has in mind, in my opinion, having talked to many officials and intellectuals in Beijing. 20, 30 years from now, you could have a world where China can access technology from Europe and from Japan. It can access markets in Europe, in India, in Southeast Asia, some of the largest and wealthiest markets in the world. It can access energy resources from the Middle East and from Russia. And so it has an extended control over this vast landmass where 2/3 of the world's population live, where more than 2/3 of the world's economic output is produced. What happens to the United States? Well, what happens to the United States is exactly what you see in the maps of the Belt and Road. Google Belt and Road, go to images and see the maps. The United States has disappeared. It's on the other side of the map. So one could imagine a world very soon, within 20, 30 years, where the United States will be prosperous, will be safe, where life will go just as it always has, but still America has become an island. America has become an isolated island on the shores of Eurasia, very safe, very prosperous, but removed from the world's affairs, no longer influential, and essentially where the world is managed by China. Now, this is a scenario, of course. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Frightening
but
one.
It has become, in a way...
It's encircling itself internally. Will it be able to overcome those?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. One is China spends more on internal security than it does on national defense, which tells you something about regime stability and social churn in China and the results of what reform has done, actually. Not just in terms of inequality, but in terms of anticipation of expectations among people, of what they want from society and their government. And I think that's changed a lot. But for me, the bigger question is, I think we make the mistake of thinking, oh, China's going to be another, like a Western hegemon, like the US, or like Britain was before that. And there's nothing in Chinese history or political culture to suggest that China will be a provider of global public goods, that China sees herself as running a global order. Besides, if you look at China's experience of order has always been hierarchical. And orders, by definition, are hierarchical. But there's not even the excuse of some democratic consultation when Belt and Road is done, for instance. There's no attempt to say, okay, let's all sit and work this out. So I think there will be resistance.
But it has been
for
tempered. Has that not been tempered? When China now talks of Belt and Road, there's much more transparency.
No, I think China's ready to negotiate. China has always dealt with the relative balance of power. So when she senses resistance, she negotiates and works her way around it. But the moment you negotiate something, you've already accepted it. It's just the terms that are negotiable. So for me, it's very hard to see China behaving in the future like, say, the US has behaved in the last 30 years, or as Great Britain used to behave. And I think there's a huge argument within China. I have never heard so many Chinese friends telling me, why are we wasting time spending our money abroad? And I think the regime knows this. If you think of back to 2015-16, when capital controls were relatively easy, China lost $1 trillion which went abroad within a year, and promptly, of course, reimposed capital controls and so on. So China has to run a very different sort of state than what we are used to in global hegemons. My own sense is China's making two transitions which are very difficult to do. One is to become a maritime power, which she's never been in history. The other thing is she is for the first time dependent on the rest of the world. We keep talking of Chinese power, but she needs the commodities, the markets, the financing, the technology. The more connected you are to the world, and in the Chinese case, again, it's around half of GDP, the more dependent you are on the world. It's the same with us in India. 80% of our imports are maintenance imports, fertilizer, energy. China needs energy from the rest of the world. So she's dependent on the world at a time when she's very powerful. This has never happened before in history to her. And that's a really hard thing to get your head around. The idea that you have power, but you know how to restrain it and use it with other people in a system where all these states have been told you're all equally sovereign. It's a lie, but the fact is we all believe in this Westphalian system that we're all equal and we have a voice and we each have one vote in the UN. So these are not easy transitions for China to make. So I'd be very careful in jumping to big conclusions about where we're going.
All right, so I want to go around to all of you with a very, very simplistic question. It's almost banal. Before I hand over to the audience for questions, the question is simply this. We have spoken about the internal contradictions of China, the possibility that its rise could be hampered by its own problems. The situation with India's economy certainly does not need to be underlined. Clearly, everybody who watches India closely, cares about India's economy closely, has already said there's trouble ahead. Given that we're only 20 years into this century, are we still quite convinced this is going to be Asia's century? Bruno?
That it's going to be a?
Asia's century?
No, I don't think it will be. Again, I don't like this idea of Asia and Europe anymore. How do you distinguish? What is the difference between Europe and Asia? If anyone has an answer that can convince me, please talk to me after the session. I'll be
There's
around.
There's a line somewhere in Russia that
I'll be around trying to hear a convincing answer because I've never heard one. So I think I talk about a Eurasian century because I think the main question to be decided is the shape of Eurasia. Where is Europe going? Is Europe going to be more aligned with China or the United States? Where is India going? Where is Russia going? The Eurasian chessboard is in mutation, is in movement, and we don't know what the final shape will be. There are some things we know. I mean, we know that China will be a very powerful country. We know that the United States will be a very powerful country, and we know that the United States and China will not get along.
All right.
I mean, those three things we know, but the rest, the shape of Eurasia as a whole, is completely open at the time.
Sure. Possibly not an Asian century, but a Eurasian century, Professor Nayyar?
No, I think not. As I said, Western Europe is in relative decline. I think the idea of the Asian century, if I may say so candidly, is hyperbole. Just go back to history. The end of the 19th century was a turning point. It was about the rise of Britain to dominance in the world, the age of Pax Britannica. The end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century was a next turning point. It was about the rise of the United States slowly to dominance. It took about 50 years to play out, and a relative decline of Britain. I think that the turn of this century, the 21st, is a third turning point. I do believe that Asia will regain its economic, if not political significance by 2050. And therefore, it will be an important player at much lower levels of income than the West, than it will be in political terms, perhaps because of low income levels.
Interesting distinction there.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Menon.
Well, if Asia accounts for 50% of world GDP by 2050, of course it's a nation century. But it seems to me that global politics is fragmenting and will probably keep fragmenting. From India's point of view, the important thing is that on the primary contradiction, which is between China and the US, as Bruno says, it's important that we be closer to each of them than they are to each other. Because, I mean, that's what Bismarck would have done, and that's classic, sort of balance of power. So it seems to me that as long as we can position ourselves like that, then it will be a nation century. And I think that's worthwhile. But we are talking about...
not an equilateral triangle, but an isosceles one with India somewhere in the middle.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. Questions? I'm going to take a range of questions and then come back to you, and you can choose what you want to answer. The first row, and then we'll come to the back.
Hi. I think, it's sort of an interesting session to see, how the epicenter of business is moving from Asia to Europe and across the globe. So I have a question for Mr. Menon and Mr. Nayyar. What do you think, India need to do to be a leading player in Asia rising world?
Thank you. There was a lady over here. If we can just get a mic to her.
2050 is a word that has been thrown around quite a lot. And 2050 is also something that my kids at age of 8 and 9 say that that's going to be the end of their lives. And 2050 is also a time when scientists have said that, a third to two-thirds of the glaciers are going to melt, and billions of people are going to be impacted, and there's going to be a huge refugee crisis because of climate change. I mean, does Asia have a chance?
Well, certainly, and guilty as charged. We got through this entire session without discussing climate change, so thank you for bringing that in. There's one gentleman behind you with a question.
One's just a side note, in that list that Professor Nayyar mentioned, I couldn't help but notice the absence of Iran, the top 10 countries. The other one, which is the meteor question, is how do you see the role of the rising sort of sense of Eastern multilateralism, in the form of AIFB and the OBOR, vis-a-vis how these Western institutions have shaped multilateralism over the last few decades? And do you think this will be as cohesive as the Western system, not order, but the Western system of multilateralism has been? Thank you.
Lovely. And I think there's somebody here who had a hand up, but I might be, oh, Mr. Jha is right here.
Thank you very much, all of you. I just wanted to ask a couple of simple questions. One is, there is the difference between the hegemonic, in a sense, struggle today between the US and China.
Mike.
There's a difference between the hegemonic struggle, of the US and China, and the hegemonic struggle of the First and Second World Wars between UK and Germany, which is that those were two hegemonic aspirants whose power was based on industry and was completely circumscribed within their national boundaries plus colonies. In this case, China is a very different kind of power because its entire power is based on trade. And trade is the easiest things to disrupt with war. The first thing that destroys trade is war. Therefore, China has a tremendously powerful interest in peace, which makes it a very different kind of hegemonic structure. I don't even think that the term, the hegemonic conflict,
so there's a difference. I get your point.
I would like a comment from both of you.
Okay, thank you. And there's a lady in front. Oh, okay, and all right, you've got the mic.
You talked about the possibility of conflict between the US and China. What's the chance of conflict between India and China? I mean, everyone seems to be in defense circles looking at Pakistan. Is China a threat to India?
All right, and the last one, if I can just get the lady over here, second row. And then you can answer whichever ones you want, but I think Williams.
Well, my question actually was for Bruno. What can India do to create cities of the future which are more better in economic development and human development than China?
Okay, which one of you wants to go first? Go ahead.
I will give bullet answers. Time is short. First, Iran is close to the 10. It's very hard for me to predict how it will unfold, but certainly Iran, interestingly Vietnam, they will be countries that are up there, okay? Second, what should India do to be part of this story? I think India needs to get its act together at home. And that requires a public provision of education and healthcare. The belief that we can become global leaders by some dexterity in foreign policy has no foundation in history. It is rubbish, as Shankar just said. You need to get your act together at home. Third, I think Prem is quite right. China's rise to power is associated with enormous vulnerability, not simply as an importer of primary commodities as it turns neo-colonial in Africa, but also that it is extraordinarily dependent on trade, and now, if the Belt and Road Initiative goes through, on finance. Vulnerability in trade can be very acute, and vulnerability in finance can be even more acute. As John Maynard Keynes wrote in 1935, if you owe someone £100, it's your problem. If you owe someone £1 million, it's their problem. Now that is true for the United States. Let me come to the last question, and
Williams,
I'll stop. I leave it to Shankar to answer the question of China and India, the conflict. But I do want to say, and it connects with the question of multilateralism. You know, Japan was the apex of global value chains, not the United States, in Asia. China replaced it starting around 1995. China cannot create a new multilateralism if it is on the model of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or even the BRICS Bank, so dominated by China, just as the Bretton Woods twins were dominated by the United States, okay? Less so the United Nations, but even that. Now, I think what might create, and I'm turning your question on its head, I think China and India need to set aside their rivalry if they want to reshape the world order, to create rules of the game that give smaller countries, latecomers to development, the policy space that they need. I worry about two things. A, China-India rivalry. Together, they could help change the world, the international financial architecture. Divided, they will get nowhere. I also worry about the fact that China and India are more likely to want to sit at the high table with the big boys once they get there, rather than remember the solidarity with smaller, poorer, weaker countries.
All right, nice point.
Well, what does India do to become a leading power? Exactly as he said, sort its own problems out. And frankly, whether we are a leading power or not is something that should be determined by whether it helps us to transform India. It's not about our status in the world. It's about taking care of our own condition, of not having so many poor, hungry, illiterate people in India. I mean, this is what we should be concentrating on. The rest comes naturally, the rest of the world. And that's true of all rising powers in history. They've concentrated on and they haven't engaged with the rest of the world or sought to be. Those who did too early, like Japan in the 30s, or Germany, Wilhelmine Germany, they crashed. And look what they did to themselves. So it's very important that we, you know, as Narasimha Rao used to say, apni aukad samjho. You know, you need to know where you stand.
But you need to dream as well.
No, wait. First things first. transform India, then, and everything else, the external policy, everything else only serves that goal. It enables the transformation of India. And I feel very strongly about this, because if you can go around chasing a UN Security Council seat, is it going to feed anybody in India? I don't see that. So for me, it's very important that you be clear about what your fundamental goals are. About 2050, you know, we can say all this quite happily because none of us is going to be here in 2050, quite frankly. But you're right. We have not mentioned 4 or 5 very big things that are actually going to change the future. You see the whole, you know, digital manufacturing, AI, I mean, technology, for one. You mentioned climate change. There's an energy revolution going on. And all these will change the economics of manufacturing, of industrialization in fundamental ways that I think, and there's no way that we can predict this today. So the uncertainty is much higher. So we're in a peculiar situation. More people lead better, healthier, longer lives than ever before in Earth's history. But if you ask people, we are more nervous, more frightened, more insecure than we've ever been before.
And we actually have less wars right now than we've ever had.
Well, not quite. We're now
The
back
last
to Cold War, pre-Cold War levels. If you look at refugees globally, we're now back to post-World War II levels, which is, you know, Chinese Civil War and Europe just after World War II. So we're not in a very happy state. Deaths by conflict are back to roughly 1947-48 levels. Which is not so good. So, but to answer your question, frankly, we can't answer those. Those are just too big, we don't know enough to. About India and China, it doesn't make sense for either of us. We have better things to do. As I said, transform India rather than, and for the last 40 years, that's what we did. We both concentrated on what really mattered, our own domestic changes, transformations, and on dealing with a unipolar world with the US, and we kept the peace. In fact, the India-China border is the most peaceful border we have among all our borders. The one that's most defined with Pakistan is the one where all the bad things on earth happen, whether it's smuggling or cross-border terrorism and so on. The one that's least defined, the last death was in 1975 by accident in the fog. So it seems to me that if you show political sense and any sense of larger strategy of what is important to India, that is something you will avoid. And the Chinese will also try and avoid it for the same reason. They have better things to do as well. The trouble, of course, is, it's, how do I put it? It's sexy, right? So you'll get a lot of commentary about India-China rivalry. B, it helps defense budgets and the whole security establishment. So they will never let you forget this idea. And this works in China as well.
What about the string of problem is the Arunachal and all these
where's the problem?
And
where's the problem? We've signed a legal agreement with China in 1993 which says we'll respect the status quo, we will not change it by military means, and that agreement has worked. Nothing has changed on that border since 1993. Not 1 inch of territory has gone this way or that. So, frankly, to me, the last 40 years is an example of successful managing of a difficult relationship, a complicated relationship, and of a strategic view of that relationship. The day you become tactical, the day you seek status, or you seek revenge for 62, or you play it for domestic political gain, you're in trouble. Right. And that can happen. I'm not saying it can't happen. After all, it's human beings who do this. But for me, it makes no sense.
So the rivalry can be economic, but not political. The last word to you, Bruno.
Yes, so what should India do to improve its human development standards? I mean, what we know from history and from recent history is that a country cannot improve its human development standards if it doesn't go through a process of widespread industrialization. So I'm sometimes puzzled when I see discussions in India that India should move straight to a services economy. I don't think that's the solution. India needs to attract foreign investment. There's a lot of appetite, by the way. I work with companies. Besides being a writer, I also work with companies regularly. I see a lot of appetite now for big companies to come into India, because suddenly China has become problematic, Vietnam and Indonesia are not big enough. There's a resource pool of talent here in India. And so I think the messages from the authorities has to be that India is open to foreign investment, and you don't sacrifice your autonomy or sovereignty or independence by having good companies work here and bring technology. Now, very quickly, 20 seconds, India and China and the rivalry. I'm also skeptical about the possibility of a conflict between India and China, and the fundamental reason, as I see it, is that both India and China are not happy with the world order as it has existed for the past 70 years. Fundamentally, we cannot call India a beneficiary of the world order as it has existed. And so in a way, they have this in common. And you see that even when relations are tense, in the end, there is a common project of building a world order that works better both for India and for China.
All right, very interesting. It's not often you do a panel like this and actually get some answers, but I'd like to thank all our panelists and you for being such a great audience on what can be such a complex issue. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much to our speakers for this beautiful session, and also our sponsors, Mahindra World City, Jaipur. So you can start telling before then.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been an amazing audience. Now it's time for you to win something. So one lucky member from the audience is sitting on the Zomato hot seat. So just look at your, turn around, check the backrest of your seat and see if it's you. What you need to do is you need to bring that sticker here and claim your prize. Come. We have a goodie bag from Zomato for you. Let's hear it for our lucky winner, everyone. So we have a goodie bag waiting for you. Here you go. Enjoy the products.